Hello and welcome once again to yesterday's airlines. Following the V1400 brand announcement that I published a few days back, we're back in this video to the grind of the usual 400 scale release rankings. Just joking. No, it's Gemini Jet's time for their October release announcements. So let's check out what Gemini are going to give us next month. But before we do that, let's have a look at what they put out from that September set and how those models look. Looking across these, none of them are disasters, but they kind of fit with exactly where I thought they'd be. Some of the models look really quite nice, like the United 777s with the flaps up and flaps down varieties. And then you've got, the regional jets, which look okay, but, do show the weakness of the mould, especially that United Express E175. Even the Gemini angled photo doesn't make it look particularly good, I have to admit. And obviously when you're getting it to the CRJ200, where the mould isn't really even as good as the 3D design deck mould. So, they're pretty mediocre. The China Northern MD90 looks okay, but something slightly odd with the nose gear on that. Hard to tell from the angle of the photograph. It looks a little high in comparison to previous MD90s. And then, checking out other models like the Pan Am 757, it just illustrates the age of the mould there. It doesn't look particularly good. The seam looks rather obvious, especially when they've got a white fuselage, and the engine, does that look bent out of shape? Maybe a little. And just the join to the wing. It's just an obsolete mould fundamentally, but it doesn't look horrific, and the same can be said about the Qantas 737-800 as well. Again, just an obsolete mould, but could be worse. The Delta 757-300, that one looks better than the 200, I would argue, and yeah, the 7779 for Etihad, that fantasy model, yeah, it looks okay as well, but it is a fantasy model. So, yeah, nothing, to be honest, to get overly excited about amongst that set, aside from the B52, which is the standout performer, I think, of that last set of models, both in terms of the originality and also the mould. And this one looks really nice, and that might be a model that I'm tempted to acquire and maybe even to review for. That one looks great. So that's the model of the month from last month. But what have we got this month? Well, we've got another selection of Gemini models, no military ones this month, and only a single Airbus. So not a huge amount of diversity in terms of aircraft type, but nonetheless a couple of interesting choices, which we'll get into in a second. Before we do that, as always, don't forget to check out my other channels and subscribe to this one if you haven't already, and chuck a like on the vid as well. I appreciate that. Also, don't forget to check out my sponsor for this video, Northeast Diecast, who, as I often say, and because it's true, have a really good range of 200 and 400 scale models at a whole wide variety of price ranges. Some really rare material and some less rare material, but always good service in my experience, and some really interesting models. So check them out and get 15% off your order when you use the code yesterday's airlines 15. That's 15% off, which is a big saving with the code yesterday's airlines 15. But let's get into this October set and check out what Gemini are throwing our way next month. So the first model this month is the only Airbus, and this one is an A330-300 in the colours of Vietjet Air. It's registered VN Alpha 811. Gemini seem to have a relationship with a Vietnamese store, and that's the reason these are getting made. They also made a Vietnamese ATR not that long ago. This one, the A330, it's certainly colourful, and you can't really fault Vietjet Air for the colour, and their A330 livery looks a little different to that on the A320. This model also has a Petrolimex special scheme on it. Petrolimex is formerly the Vietnam National Petroleum Group, so that is what that is advertising. Not a particularly exciting special scheme, really, just the titles on the front of the aircraft. In terms of Vietjet Air releases, this is the first A330 in the scale, but there have been 6 previous models a couple of which have been Gemini A321s, both of which are pretty mediocre, especially the Neo. This one will also be pretty mediocre, to be quite honest, because the A330 mould, as I've talked about many times before, that JC Wings uses is not the best in the universe. Just doesn't really compete that well with the others on the market from NG models, especially. Partly because of the undercarriage, in fact mostly because of the undercarriage, and I've talked about this before. The main gear especially is too short, and this is a failing of quite a few more recent JC Wings molds, that they just get the undercarriage too short. Look how close the engines are to the ground on this Cathay Dragon. They're really close to the ground. So yeah, not thrilled by this one. I'm just going to put this one up into Workhorse. Now the rest of the models this month are all Boeings, but there is a reasonable diversity across Boeing's aircraft portfolio, and the first one up is a Delta Airlines 717. It's N947 Alpha Tango. Now, there have been 5 previous Gemini Delta 717s, but to be fair, most of those have been on the old Phoenix mould, or at least 3 of them were. One made in 2013, 2014, 2016. They were made on that old Phoenix mould, and it's only the 2018 and 2023 versions which have been made on the newer Gemini JC mould, which is a better mould, and a really quite nice little mould. Looking at N998 Alpha Tango, which was made in 2023, to be honest, they made a bit of dog's ear. Dog's ear? Is that a saying? It's not really. It's dog's breakfast. Getting my metaphors mixed up. They made a bit of a mess of that one, to be honest. I don't really appreciate the printing on this one, especially around the cockpit, which looks pretty poor. Yeah, I'm not loving it. Not loving that one. I have to say that I reviewed a TWA 717 that they did, and the cockpit printing on that was much better. Also, this aircraft has the eyebrow windows, and the previous release it did not. Surely that's not enough of a reason to go and buy this if you've got the previous one. But I'm not hating this or finding this as mediocre as I thought, because I do think this one will have better printing. I do like the mould. So I think this will be the best of the previous versions that are made. In fact, so much so that I'm willing to put this one up into High Flyer. I could be going mad. It is probably a workhorse model, but I'm going to put it in High Flyer. I think they'll do a better job of the printing. I do like the mould. So, yeah, I'll High Flyer that one, somewhat controversially for myself. Next up, we've got a Boeing 727. So we're really going through the aircraft families, and 727s are generally pretty welcome, and they're announced a couple of future 77s which look like they could be pretty exciting. This one, perhaps less so. It's Emirates A6 Echo Mike Charlie. It is not the first Emirates 727 that has been made in 400 scale, despite the fact that Emirates hate anyone unlicensed from making their models. So there have been previous versions by Aviation 400 in 2008, and there was an Aero Classics version made as recently as 2022. AC seems to just be able to skirt around any licensing because the volumes are so small, perhaps. I don't know. The AC one looked fine. And I know that some people have issues with the Aero Classics 77 mould, and even perceive that the Gemini one is better. In reality, it isn't. It's just got different issues to the Aero Classics one. I've been a little underwhelmed by some of the recent Gemini 727s. They've made a bit of a mess of some of them. I reviewed and got the CP Air one from 2022. I think it was a rubbish model, frankly. The nose is really pointy. The cockpit printing's bad. The nose gear was poorly put on. Then you've still got issues with the mould which don't relate to just shoddy quality control. It does have a seam. It does have what is fundamentally an incorrect engine tail top. People like it because it's not seamed, but it's just not the right shape. It doesn't help that they completely messed up the livery on that CPA. In fact, I got rid of that CPA model as quick as I could, and I replaced it with an Aero Classics version I found on the seconds market, which was much, much better. But let's assume that the mould will look good, and they won't make some of the dreadful errors at the front end they made with that CP Air version. So let's assume that and be optimistic. In that case, I'll put this one up into High Flyer. And I'm tempted to get this one. I haven't got an Emirates 727 in the collection. It could be of interest. So I hope that they don't mess it up. I'm going to put this one up into High Flyer. In fact, this is a bit of a theme for this month's models. I'm looking at them going, this could be really quite good, but hey lads, it's Gemini. There's a good chance they're going to make a mess. And that MRO 77 certainly has potential to be bad. Another model which should be awesome, but potentially could go wrong, is the next one, and that one is a 737-500. I am really pleased to be seeing this model because it is a model which has been crying out for release for so long. It is a Battleship Grey United Airlines Series 500 N936UA, and this should be great. Emphasis on the should. They haven't always got the Battleship Grey colour right. They made a really, really, really bad CRJ with the lightest grey possible, which didn't match any of the previous ones. So there are so many different shades of Battleship Grey floating around that it is a bit of a concern. However, I am optimistic, again, and hopeful that they will get the colour right. And if they do, this should be a really nice model. There have been a few 735s in recent times. The most recent one that's actually got a release has been an undefined collectibles China Southern version, which somewhat ironically replaced the zinc rotter Gemini version in my model collection. That turned out really nice. It shows the potential on this 737-500 mold, which does share some of the foibles that their 300 and 400 mold has, but there isn't another one available. It's certainly good enough, and I'd like to see more usage of it. So I think this has got real star potential. For me, this is the model of the month by some distance, and I'm more than happy to supersonic this one, and I really hope they don't mess it up. Okay, now arguably those are the most interesting models that we've talked about already. Next model is a 737-900. This one is in the Continental Retro scheme for United. It is registered N75435. 75th anniversary scheme. It's, you know, it's a nice livery, very retro, very 1950s, this one. The Blue Skyway, I think this scheme was called, and it was on their DC-6s and such before the jet age. But anyway, their 900 model's better than their 800, but I'm not really feeling the need to discuss this model too much. It's been made before by NG 3 years ago, Jan 2022, and unless you're a completely new collector, why wouldn't you have just got that one? There's no way that the Gemini version is going to match the NG version that's already been released. The mold is simply nowhere near as good, and that's even before you get to the printing. So, you know, this model simply isn't going to be really that sought after, I don't think. A bit of a waste of time release, in my opinion, and very much workhorse. Okay, and that takes us out of the 737s and into a 757, which actually could be quite a good release. But again, so many caveats to put around this. Now, we don't get many 757-300s without winglets. We don't get many 757-300s. NG had their new mold and they released a few models on it, and they've kind of forgotten about it again, which is very frustrating, because Northwest Airlines would be an awesome release on the NG mold, and that's what this one is. It's Northwest in their last delivery, N587 November Whiskey, no winglets on the aircraft, which is a proper 757 in my universe. Anyway, is this going to be great? Well, let's have a look at last month's Delta 753 from Gemini. It turned out quite nicely, but it does have the seam, it does have the old wing join. They have replaced the landing gear and it's better. They have got aerials now, you know. And so this has potential. It's not the first time that Gemini have made a Northwest 757 in this scheme, because they have previously made this effectively release, but it was so long ago now that it looks, you know, like a very obsolete model. It was September 2003 they made N594 November Whiskey. Of course, something to point out is that the mould is effectively the same. So this mould is over 20 years old. It's just that, as I said, they've upgraded the mould with aerials and new undercarriage. But that is a fundamental issue with a lot of these Gemini moulds. They're often very old. They're not up to the modern standards. It's certainly not going to be competitive with the NG. But NG aren't using theirs, are they? So, yeah, not sure. There's obviously, also perhaps some questions around the finish on this, how sparkly it will be. I did once have a Dragonwings version of this, which actually looked surprisingly nice, which is even older. That was from, I know that was from 2003 as well. Not sure about this one. This could be High Flyer, but the mould is just, it's not quite there. Again, there are questions about the livery finish potentially. I've been quite generous so far in this video, especially that Delta 717 and the Emirates 72. I'm going to be less generous here. I'm just going to put this one in to Workhorse. But it does illustrate the difficulty sometimes of scoring models when you haven't seen the final product. It could be better than I think it's going to be. It could be worse. And that goes for at least 4 of the 7 models I've talked about so far in this video. Okay, next up, and we're into wide body territory with the Boeings. We've got a 777-9X. So we've got another fantasy model. Not particularly exciting me, and I hope there's not going to be a run of these fantasy models. This one they're registering ET Bravo Bravo X-ray, but as far as I'm aware, there is no registration assigned to these aircraft, so, you know, effectively doesn't mean anything. Ethiopian is going to be another early customer for the type. I think they've ordered 8 or 9. I'm not entirely sure when they're going to turn up. And this is using, once again, like last month, the mould version of the 779 with the winglets folded. Now, there is an Aviation 400 version of this mould coming, which will have movable winglets, which is going to be so much cooler than just having these static either up or down winglets. So I'll be interested to see what that looks like and when that comes out. But fundamentally, why do we need this model now? Perhaps it's because Ethiopian Airlines have asked Gemini to make it. But from a collecting perspective, yeah, it's just not necessary. I was quite generous with last month's Etihad, but I'm tiring with pointless fantasy models like this. Gemini has a bit of a history of producing models with fantasy regs. I'm just going to put this one down in Gas Guzzler. The mold isn't that bad, but it's not pulling up trees either. It's pretty ordinary from an innovation perspective because you've got static winglets. So yeah, I'm just going to Gas Guzzle that one. The combination there is not doing much for me. Now, the rest of the models this month, all 787-9 Dreamliners. We've got 2 different ones, but there are 4 versions because you've got flaps up and down. The first pair is American Airlines, N836 Alpha Alpha. This model is good because it's the JC Wings Dreamliner, but the model release is a bit pointless because they made one in January 2023 and it's still available at stores in the US. So the model hasn't sold out. Seems a bit pointless to make another one. Aviation 400 have made one last year as well. And then, of course, you've got Gemini versions, which are quite a lot older. So, yeah, I'm not sure why this model is really needed, to be honest. Maybe it's a top-up order for American, who knows? But it certainly isn't surely high on anyone's list of a model that is needed, considering you can literally go and buy the previous version, which will look exactly the same. Still. So I'm just going to put this one down into Workhorse, and we follow up, or we conclude, should I say, our Dreamliners with a North Atlantic pair. Again, flaps up and down. These are both G regs, so G Charlie Kilo Whiskey Sierra. Yeah, again, there's not a huge amount to say here either. Gemini not breaking new ground with this pair because, again, they've been made by NG. NG made a G-Reg version in November 2023. They made a Norwegian registered version in January 2024. There's not really going to be any differences there. Arguably, the NGs are probably marginally better, but it's going to be close. I should also say that JC Wings made a Norwegian version in 2023 too. So there have been a few of these around. It's just the fact this one's G-Reg, which is the difference. But Gemini are getting there after NG again. Which is fairly common. Yeah, these are just workhorse models as well, frankly. And that concludes the ranking portion of the vid. So what do I think overall for this month? Well, when I first saw the releases, I was quite optimistic and I thought that this was actually quite a good month. But then when I look at what I've done with the scoring, there's a lot of workhorse sitting around in here, isn't there? And I am concerned that that 727 for Emirates and that 717 for DL could drop down into Workhorse if the finish on the models isn't good. I think what made me feel good about the month was simply that United Airlines 737-500. That is a really sought after and great release, and as long as it comes out of the factory looking good, then that should be a killer. But most of the rest of the month is pretty mediocre. Even I think for a lot of Gemini diehard fans, they're probably not thrilled by this month's release set, and I would much rather see the Northwest 75 from NG Models if they ever remember they've got the mold still. So yeah, it's not a great month, but that United 737-500, that could be one of the models of the year if they get it right. So there's a silver lining for me, at least, in that I will definitely be getting one of these. And frankly, it's not often I get to say that about the Gemini release set, so it's certainly not all bad. Okay, well, that is it for this video. As I mentioned earlier, Gemini have announced a few future announcements, and there's some interesting models in those. So I guess we'll be seeing some of those appearing over the next 2 or 3 months. But that is it for this release ranking video for the October Geminis. We're rapidly running out of months, so there's only going to be 1 or 2 more announcements this year. But that is it for this vid. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye from yesterday's airlines.